The fall of 2025 marks the 250th anniversary of the Quebec Expedition, also called the Arnold Expedition. Although the attack on Quebec failed, Benedict Arnold's march is considered one of the greatest achievements in the history of nations, according to an early British historian. It was a dangerous journey through the wilderness of Maine for 1,150 men and 2 women, as detailed firsthand in the diaries of 19 of the expedition's patriots. Prelude to the invasion of Canada. On June 14, 1775, the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia voted to create the Continental Army, the nation's first federal armed force. It is now known as the U.S. Army. The next day, John Adams nominated George Washington as commander-in-chief, a decision that was unanimously approved by the delegates. Washington then quickly left for Boston to take command. Congress also authorized General Philip Schuyler to invade Canada and seize St. John's and Montreal, thereby preventing the British from using Canada as a base to attack the colonies. Schuyler would follow the established route through Albany, then across Lake George and Lake Champlain, and continue down the Richelieu River to the St. Lawrence River. However, his forces became stalled at Fort Ticonderoga. The 16,000 men of the newly formed Continental Army gathered in Boston were too far away to provide support. However, General Washington had heard of an alternative route to Quebec through the District of Maine, utilizing the Kennebec River and the Chaudière River to reach Quebec City. Washington reasoned that by using this wilderness route, the invading force would draw British troops away from St. John's to defend Quebec City. This strategy would allow Schuyler's army to capture St. John's and Montreal, and then join forces with Arnold to take Quebec. By capturing Canada, Washington believed that the French might be more inclined to ally with the Americans against their common enemy and possibly become the 14th colony. As a military strategist, Washington was intrigued by the idea and set out to learn more about the route, assessing whether his plan was feasible. The route through Maine had long been used by Native Americans, missionaries, and traders, and it was even marked on a 1682 French map. The Americans also possessed a copy of John Montresor's 1761 British military map and his edited journal showing the route from Fort Halifax to the St. Lawrence River. Washington sought more information before committing to the attack. Reuben Colburn was a source. Colburn owned a sawmill and built boats along Maine's Kennebec River. He had heard rumors of a potential attack on Canada using the Maine route. On August 13th, he traveled to Cambridge to advocate for this route and to make it known that he was willing to build the boats needed for such a venture. He brought Chief Swashen and his braves, who had recently arrived at Swan Island on the Kennebec River after following the Indian path described by Montresor, demonstrating the viability of the wilderness route. Washington believed that a quick-moving force carrying minimal equipment could cross the Maine route in 20 days, an estimate that turned out to be unrealistic. Washington needed someone to lead the attack who could motivate his troops, make quick decisions, and show boldness and bravery. The Army's pool of officers with these qualities was small. Many officers from the colonial militias had limited military training. The troops elected some, and most were not respected by the men they led. General Washington wrote to his cousin, "Their officers, generally speaking, are the most indifferent kind of people I ever saw." Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox were considered for the role. Both were good officers, but neither possessed the daring and courageous spirit needed for this tough task. On August 10th, General Washington met with Arnold to discuss the possibility of an incursion into Canada. Arnold supported the idea and offered his services for such an operation. Washington knew that Arnold was a controversial figure, as many officers did not hold him in high regard due to his stubborn and impulsive nature. However, he was brave and resourceful, capable of making decisions without being hindered by political concerns. Additionally, Arnold is familiar with Quebec, having visited it on numerous business trips. Washington chooses Benedict Arnold to lead the expedition. He tells Arnold that if he and Schuyler team up in Quebec, Arnold will defer to Schuyler as the senior officer. On August 21st, Arnold writes to Colburn, asking if he can quickly build 200 bateaux capable of carrying 6 or 7 men, along with their provisions and baggage. On August 26, Washington, through Arnold, instructs Reuben Colburn to send scouts along the planned route to evaluate the obstacles the invading army might face on its march to Quebec. Colburn hired Dennis Getchell and Samuel Barry from Vassalboro to explore the wilderness route. The two men depart on September 1st and return on September 13th, having traveled only about 30 miles beyond the Great Carrying Place. They cut short their scouting trip after an Indian they met, Natanis, informed them that British troops were stationed just inside the Canadian border and at the headwaters of the Chaudière River. Arnold is skeptical of their report. On September 2nd, Washington signs an order authorizing a secret attack on Quebec. The Quebec Expedition would be only the second action taken by the Continental Army since its founding, 12 weeks earlier, with the Siege of Boston being the first. The next day, Reuben Colburn receives a contract to build 200 bateaux and is instructed to send 20 men with the expedition to maintain them. He is also told to gather provisions for the expedition, including 500 bushels of Indian corn and 60 barrels of beef. Colburn has 3 weeks to provide 200 craft. The expedition had its commander, and now it was Washington's task to decide how the invading force would be organized. First, he informed Arnold that everyone joining the expedition needed to be volunteers in good physical shape. He then formed 2 battalions of musketeers and 3 rifle companies, comprising troops from Pennsylvania and Virginia. To save time, Washington decided that the 1150 troops would travel by boat to Fort Western, from where the expedition would march to Quebec along the waterland route mapped by Montresor. Early on, Washington refers to the Independent Expeditionary Force as the Arnold Expedition. Our account starts on September 11th. The 3 rifle companies, led by Daniel Morgan, are the first to leave Cambridge. The 2 musket battalions were to leave the next day, but refused until they received 1 month's wage in advance as promised. September 13th. Paid, the troops began their 2-day march to Newburyport. The 14th through the 18th was a time for reviews, parades, church services, and gathering final supplies. September 19th. With no British ships nearby and favorable winds, the troops board 11 vessels for the 100-mile, 24-hour voyage to the Kennebec River. Many suffered from seasickness. Dr. Center's journal. Heavy wind with considerable rain, this bringing on a swell, occasioned most of the troops to disgorge themselves of their luxuries so plentifully laid in air before we embarked. September 20th. One of the ships anchored off Arrowsick Island and boarded 20 local men under the command of Samuel McCobb for the expedition. September 21st. Arnold's ship is becalmed just short of Colburn's shipyard. Anxious to inspect the bateaux, he launches a long boat and is rowed the distance. Arnold finds that the bateaux are smaller than he expected and made of green wood. He orders 20 more built at a reduced price to compensate for their smaller size. Reuben Colburn never receives full payment for 220 bateaux. September 23rd. The rest of the fleet arrives at Gardnerstown. Unable to reach Fort Western due to low water, the supplies are unloaded and transported to Fort Western by bateaux and small boats. September 24th. During the night, a drunken soldier shoots and kills a fellow soldier. The culprit, court-martialed and condemned to hang, is instead taken back to Cambridge for General Washington to render judgment. Colonel Arnold dispatches Lieutenant Church and Lieutenant Steele to proceed ahead of the army. Church is tasked with locating the entrance to the Great Carrying Place and marking the route to the Dead River, an approximately 12-mile portage. Meanwhile, Steele and his men are to scout as far as Chaudière Pond, Lac Mégantic, for the enemy. He is specifically instructed to capture or kill the Indian Natanis, who is believed to be a spy for the British. September 25th. Arnold reorganizes the 2 battalions into 4 divisions, reasoning that smaller units could be staggered to prevent bottlenecks at portages and campsites along the route. The units plan to rendezvous at Chaudière Pond and proceed to Quebec as one army. The 1st Division, consisting of 3 rifle companies led by Captain Morgan, departs from Fort Western in bateaux and on foot. Arnold wants his best soldiers to be in the lead if they encounter the enemy. Orders are to clear the Great Carrying Place portage trail. as marked by Surveyor John Pierce. September 26th. Lieutenant Colonel Green's 2nd Division, consisting of 3 companies of musketmen, start upriver. September 27th. The 3rd Division, made up of 4 companies of musketmen, and led by Major Meigs, depart. Morgan's men arrive at Fort Halifax. With help from the local people, most of the expedition's supplies are brought to Fort Halifax from Fort Western by Oxguard along an old military road connecting the 2 forts. September 29th, Lieutenant Colonel Enos, along with 3 companies of musketmen and Reuben Colburn's 20 carpenters, leaves Fort Western. Arnold directs Enos to act as the rear guard and pick up stragglers. Enos's division carries most of the expedition's supplies. Arnold and his camp aide, Eleazar Oswald, follow in a leaky birch bark canoe, paddled by Indians. At Vassalboro, they switch to a dugout canoe. As the novice crews of the 220 bateaux struggle against the current and shallow water, the rest of the army arrives at Fort Halifax on foot. September 30th, Taconic Falls is the first of many portages. Each division takes most of a day to transport their bateaux and tons of supplies the 0.6 miles around the ledges. The locals help by using oxen and carts to move the supplies. The bateaux are leaking badly. October 1st, the lead elements of the army arrive at the 2nd portage, Skowhegan Falls. Ropes and pulleys are used to hoist the bateaux over the rocky face of the island above the 20-foot-high falls. A footpath leads to the island's north end, where many camp. Colburn's carpenters repair the heavily damaged and leaking bateaux. Arnold spends the night at a private home, for miles beyond the falls. October 2nd, Arnold visits the remains of the Indian village where Father Sebastian Rall and most of his Indian followers were massacred in 1724. Located a mile downstream from the 3rd carry at Norridgewock Falls. The 3rd portage is the hardest so far, nearly 3/4 of a mile around the falls and rapids. Arnold stays for almost a week to oversee the portage. He uses this time to check the food supply and finds that much of it has gone bad. Water from the leaky bateaux and spray seeped into the barrels, ruining much of the salted pork, fish, vegetables, and bread. The small settlement at the falls would be the last until Canada. This place marks the beginning of the Maine wilderness. October 4th, Morgan's division arrives at the 4th portage, Carotink Falls, in today's town of Solon. The long delays in navigating the 3 previous obstacles causes the divisions to be several days apart, with Enos's division falling further behind. October 6th, Morgan's men reach the entrance to the Great Carrying Place Portage Trail. It has been 11 days since the riflemen left Fort Western. After a day of rest, Morgan's men begin widening the narrow Indian footpath to the first pond, East Carry Pond, to accommodate the bateaux, the men carrying them, and others transporting supplies forward. Dr. Iasak Center. Second journal, not less than 7 or 8 times were each boat's crew obliged to pass, back and forth, before the last article was passed over. Our bateaux in Janelle weighed not less than 400 pounds, which, with provisions, we made not less than 800 weight on average, to be transported by 5 or 6 hands over each carrying place. October 7th, 8. 9 Meigs and Green's divisions arrive at the portage entrance and begin their trek toward the Dead River. October 11th, Arnold arrives at the entrance of the portage. Lieutenant Church meets with Arnold and explains to him the lay of the land over the 12-mile portage to the Dead River. The route is difficult, but it can be improved, he tells Arnold. Arnold writes in his journal about how to locate the entrance to the Great Carrying Place Portage Trail. Benedict Arnold's Journal. Weds. October 11th, 1775, when abreast of the carrying place in the river. You will observe at 400 yards above you a large mountain in the shape of a sugar loaf at the foot of which the river turns off to the eastward. This mountain, when you are at the carrying place, seems to rise out of the middle of the river, today's Henhock Ledge. October 12th, Lieutenant Steele returns from scouting to Chaudière Pond. Despite their ordeal in reaching the pond, they encounter no Indians. Steele informs Arnold about what lies ahead for the army. He estimates it is 80 miles from the last carrying place, and for the most part, it is a fine, deep river with little current. although some sections have a fast current and 5 short portages. Arnold orders Steele and Church to take 20 axemen to clear the way to Chaudière Pond. Steele is to continue down the Chaudière River and examine the falls and portages, then return to Chaudière Pond. Arnold orders a log house, hospital, to be built on the west side of the first pond to house 8 to 10 soldiers, incapable of continuing to Quebec. Matthew Irvine, a surgeon's assistant, is told to remain there to care for the sick men, along with 4 to 5 men not so well, but capable of assisting Irvine to operate the hospital. Enos is to leave a bateau at each pond to ferry the incapacitated men back to Arnold's hospital. Arnold orders that a second building be constructed between the first pond and the Kennebec River, intended to store provisions in case the army needs to make a quick retreat. The supplies were never delivered from Fort Western. October 13th, Green's and Meagh's divisions reached the Dead River. Arnold dispatches 2 Indians to deliver a letter to his friend in Quebec, John Mercier. A French-speaking soldier, John Hall accompanies them only as far as Sardigan, a backwoods area inhabited by Frenchmen and Indians living along the Chaudière River, 90 miles from Quebec. Hall is to gauge the sentiments of the inhabitants toward the advancing Americans. Hall will rendezvous with Arnold at Chaudière Pond in 7 to 8 days. Unbeknownst to Arnold, John Hall was a double agent working for Great Britain. October 14th, Arnold reaches the second pond, Middle Carry Pond, which makes as desolate an appearance as the first, East Carry Pond. The water is thick and muddy, he writes. Arnold arrives at the third pond, West Carry Pond, where he encamps for the night. He notes a snow-capped, forked mountain in the distance, which exceeds the rest in height, adding beauty to the scene, Mount Bigelow. Arnold writes a letter to General Washington, advising him of their slow progress. October 15th, Arnold sends instructions to Lieutenant Colonel Enos to advance the yoke of oxen to the Dead River for slaughter. Each man who passes will receive a pound of meat. He orders the men to reduce their rations to 3/4 of a pound of pork and 3/4 of a pound of flour per day. Starvation becomes a real possibility if they fail to reach Quebec in 25 days. Arnold crosses the third pond and follows the portage trail up the hill, passing through a gap in the mountain, and continues for another mile downhill to the edge of a swamp, where he, Oswald, and the Indian guides join other troops for the night. October 16th, Arnold's party crosses the Savannah, an extensive open marsh with scattered islands of spruce. After much struggle, they reach a small stream, Bog Brook. Then, canoeing for less than a mile, arrive at the Dead River. Arnold orders 10 men from each company of Meagh's division to go back and improve the route for those behind. Arnold and the rest of Meagh's division proceed west, following the meandering river, portaging 40 yards around a small fall, Hurricane Falls. October 17th, Arnold sends Major Bigelow with 96 men to the rear to bring extra food forward from Enos's division. Captain Thayer notes in his journal that his company has only 5 to 6 pounds of flour left for 60 men. October 19th, it begins to rain. Green's division waits for Bigelow's return with food, while Morgan's men and Meagh's division continue upriver. Arnold also advances. Ahead of all the others are Steele and Church with 20 men clearing the way over the height of land and into Canada. October 20th, the rain continues all day and into the night and into the following day. Morgan, Meagh's and Arnold struggle forward despite the rising North Branch Dead River. Green is still waiting for food to arrive. October 21st, more rain. Darkness falls on Arnold before he finds a suitable place to camp. At 4 in the morning, he is awakened by the sound of rushing water. Arnold and his men scramble to higher ground as the river overflows its banks. A wall of water rushes down the river, causing first Meagh's and then Morgan's division to flee from the floodwater. Casks of food, gear, and bateaux wash away. October 22nd, the stunned troops spent most of the day retrieving what was lost and drying their clothes and salvage equipment. Meanwhile, downriver, Lieutenant Colonel Enos arrives at Green's encampment looking for Arnold, only to find that Arnold has moved ahead. Before returning to his division, Enos informs Green that his men are nearly out of food and can spare only 2 barrels of flour. Soon after Enos leaves, Bigelow arrives with the flour. October 23rd, Meigs and Morgan's company moves several miles upriver. The flood has obscured the river channel, causing many of them to go up the wrong stream. Alderbrook, Bateau are sent 2 miles up the waterway to find them and to bring them back. Realizing their mistake, most of the men find their way back to the river on their own. Once the division regroups, they move on to the next portage, where the strong current of the raging river capsizes 7 bateaux, causing further loss of provisions. Arnold joins Meigs' division along with 2 of the rifle companies that Morgan left behind in his sprint to reach Chaudière Pond. They camp on high ground, near today's Chateauguay Falls, which later will become known as Camp Disaster. That night, Arnold convenes a council of war to discuss the dire situation with his officers. They agree to move forward. It is decided that a 50-man party will leave immediately to reach the first settlements on the Chaudière River and return with desperately needed food. Arnold also sends 26 sick men back to Fort Western. Furthermore, it is determined that Enos and Green's divisions need to advance more quickly and forward the supplies that Arnold had assumed Enos had shared with Green's division. Arnold decides that all the weak and infirmed members of the army should be sent back to Fort Western. Green and Enos never received Arnold's written instructions. October 24th, Captain Hanchet's 50-man rescue party rushes to the Chaudière River to find the nearest French settlements. Arnold, accompanied by 9 men, leaves Camp Disaster a few hours later. The remaining troops keep marching forward along the Dead River. Green sends a courier to find Arnold and inform him of the division's plight, but the colonel has pressed on. He dispatches a second courier downriver to find Enos to request a meeting. October 25th, Green sends around 48 ill men back to civilization, then advances with his remaining men about 3 miles and sets up camp at Camp Disaster. Enos and his senior officers arrive to meet with Green for a council of war. The men debate whether to turn back or proceed forward. A vote is taken, and Enos opts to move ahead. However, his men choose to go back. Enos informs Green that it is his duty to remain with his men and that he will return with his division. The officers argue over the remaining supplies, with Enos claiming he has no extra food and that what he has needs to last his division until they escape the wilderness. Finally, Enos agrees to share his provisions with Green's men. However, when Green's men arrive at Enos's campsite, all they are given is another 2 barrels of flour. That night, Enos and his 3 companies abandoned the expedition and began the walk back to Cambridge, arriving there on November 23rd. Reuben Colburn's repair crew returns as well. The Arnold expedition has lost 300 men. Arnold doesn't learn of Enos' retreat until November 8th. Arnold's party reaches the first of a 6-mile series of ponds. Today, it is known as Chain of Ponds. October 26th, Arnold and his party arrive at Moosehorn Pond, today's Arnold Pond, and immediately search for the portage called the Terrible Carrying Place that would take them over the mountains into Canada. Late in the afternoon, they find the entrance, leave their boats behind, and follow Surveyor Pierce's markers up the side of today's Louise Mountain. Arnold encounters Pierce with 20 men working to improve the trail. The 2 groups camp together. At night, they see fires in the distance and post guards in case they are British campfires. October 27th, Arnold sends a courier to inform those behind to abandon their bateaux and proceed on foot. Descending the mountain, Arnold encounters Captain Hanchet and his 50 men. It was their campfires that they had seen the previous night. Hanchet had brought 4 bateaux over the height of land at a lower elevation by clearing their own route. Together, they proceed to 7 Mile Stream, today's Arnold River. Arnold, anxious to reach Chaudière Pond, takes the boats and starts down the stream, leaving Hanchet and his men to walk along the riverbank. Arnold encounters Steele and Church paddling up the river in a canoe. They tell Arnold that the French are friendly and eager to help. Steele and Church take Arnold to a bark hut they found on the east shore of the lake. That night, fires are started to guide Hanchet's men toward Chaudière Pond. Bateaux are launched to search for the missing men who are hopelessly lost in the swamp that surrounds the pond's southern end. It was nearly midnight by the time all the men are rescued. Daniel Morgan's rifle company ignores Arnold's order and transports 7 bateaux over the Terrible Carry, ultimately losing them in the rapids of the Chaudière River. October 28th, Arnold sends Lieutenant Isaac Hull back to assist others to avoid the quagmire by following a narrow strip of land across the swamp to the lake. Meanwhile, Arnold, Steele, Church, and 13 men in 4 bateaux and 1 canoe continue toward the outlet of Chaudière Pond and then down the Chaudière River to reach the nearest French settlements. As they speed down the Chaudière, 2 bateaux strike rocks and are destroyed. Arnold and 6 men hurry towards Sardigan in the 2 remaining bateaux. Green's division is the last to enter Canada. At the meadow near 7 Mile Stream, Meigs and Green's divisions meet and divide the remaining food. Each man receives 5 pints of flour and 2 ounces of meat. October 29th, Lieutenant Hull tries to lead 5 companies to the lake, but loses his way, causing the men to flounder aimlessly in the quagmire and forcing them to camp for the night. The struggling soldiers excoriate Hull, and he earns the title Pretended Pilot. The next morning, they discover unexplained footprints in the snow that lead to Chaudière Pond. Private Abner Stocking's journal. I thought we were probably the first human beings that ever took up their residence for a night in this wilderness, not a howling wilderness, for I believe no wild animals would inhabit it. October 30th, Arnold arrives at Sardigan and immediately arranges for provisions to be delivered to his starving men. October 31st, relief parties leave Sardigan to deliver food to the struggling army. Hanchet's detail are among the first to arrive at Sardigan. November 1st, stretching for miles. Soldiers stagger in small groups and individually along the bank of the Chaudière River. All order has broken down. It's every person for themselves. Provisions are exhausted, and men are starving. 2 dogs, one belonging to Captain Dearborn and the other to Captain Thayer, are killed and eaten, while others resort to eating leather, soap, and cartridge boxes. Private Abner Stocking watched Jemima Warner stay with her husband when he became too sick to go on. After he died, she covered him with leaves, took his gun, and kept moving towards Sardigan. George Morrison's journal. This day, I roasted my shot pouch and ate it. It was now 4 days since I had eaten anything, save the skin of a squirrel. November 2nd, Lieutenant Steele, on horseback, leads a small herd of cattle driven by men from Sardigan and is among the first of the relief parties to reach the starving army. Other relief parties deliver mutton and meal to men struggling further up the river. Private Abner Stocking. A cow was immediately killed and cut open in great haste, a small calf being found in her. It was divided up and eaten without further ceremony. I got a little piece of the flesh, which I eat raw with a little oatmeal wet with cold water, and I thought I feasted sumptuously. November 3rd, most of the ragtag army leaves Sardigan, walking 10 to 20 miles each day toward the St. Lawrence while buying supplies from residents. November 4th, the remnants of Meigs' division are the last to arrive at Sardigan. The backward residents eagerly welcomed the American army and are more than willing to charge a hefty amount for their goods. Lieutenant William Humphrey's journal. The people were civil, but mighty extravagant with what they have to sell. November 7th, Arnold arrives at Point Levis with contingents of the Expeditionary Force. By November 9th, most units had assembled there, marking the first time since Fort Western that the Army was unified under Arnold's command. After traveling 270 miles over 45 days through the Maine and Canadian wilderness, Benedict Arnold can finally see his objective across the St. Lawrence River, the walled city of Quebec. An invasion force that numbered 1,150 men when it left Cambridge on September 11th now consists of just over 600 sickly, poorly armed, and equipped troops. An estimated 40 to 50 Americans died from sickness, fatigue, or starvation before the Army managed to break free from the wilderness. Although the Americans' attack on Quebec failed, the Arnold Expedition is remembered as one of the greatest adventure stories of a struggling nation fighting for self-determination. And so ends our tale of the Arnold Expedition's trek from Cambridge to Quebec. Our thanks to Norman Collick for researching and compiling this timeline, and to Michael Holt for working with Google Gemini to generate the pictures. Sources: Benedict Arnold's Army, Arthur S. Lefkowitz. An American Triumph, Tom Hand. March to Quebec, Kenneth Roberts. Voices Waiting to be Heard, Stephen Darley.